I panicked and said to the alien wild vampire woman, "Your ass is so nice," and her reaction was incredible. The survey pod hit Azira's atmosphere at entirely the wrong angle, which Jaren Vale would later reflect was a perfect metaphor for his entire career. The navigation system had decided, in its infinite silicon wisdom, that catastrophic malfunction was the ideal time to display a cheerful error message. Oops. Something went wrong, smiley face. The smiley face felt particularly insulting as the pod began its uncontrolled tumble through clouds the color of dried blood. Jaren had approximately 45 seconds to contemplate his life choices before impact. He spent 30 of those seconds screaming, 10 trying to remember emergency protocols, and 5 wondering if his mother had been right about him pursuing a nice, safe career in hydroponics instead of xenobiology. The crash harness dug into his shoulders as the pod spun, and his last coherent thought before the world exploded into noise and fire was that the Frontier Survey Corps really needed to update their landing algorithms. The impact drove the air from his lungs and filled his vision with dancing lights that had nothing to do with Azira's bioluminescent ecosystem. When the world stopped spinning and his ears stopped ringing, Jaren found himself hanging sideways in the harness, surrounded by sparking electronics and the acrid smell of burning insulation. His head throbbed. His ribs screamed. But he was alive, which seemed almost unfair given the smoking crater his pod had presumably just created. "Status report," he croaked to the onboard AI. Silence answered him, punctuated only by the hiss of escaping atmosphere and the distant sound of something that might have been wind or might have been indigenous fauna. Computer. Nothing. Hello. Still nothing. Well, that's just fantastic. Jaren fumbled with the harness release, his fingers clumsy in the pod's failing gravity field. When he finally dropped free, he landed in an awkward heap among the scattered remains of his equipment. His shoulder hit something sharp, and he bit back a curse that would have made his academy instructors proud. Through the cracked viewport, crimson light filtered in, painting everything the color of rust and old blood. The external door had been partially torn away during the crash, which made exit easier but did terrible things for his long-term survival prospects. Jaren squeezed through the gap, immediately regretting it as jagged metal scraped across his environment suit, and emerged into an alien world that was simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. Twin moons hung in a purple sky, their reflected light turning the landscape into something from a fever dream. Obsidian cliffs rose like broken teeth in the distance, while closer vegetation pulsed with soft bioluminescence, blues and greens and colors Jaren's earth-trained eyes couldn't quite categorize. The air smelled wrong, tasting of copper and something organic he couldn't identify. His suit's atmospheric analyzer flickered weakly, displaying oxygen levels that were technically breathable but would leave him perpetually winded. Okay, Jaren muttered to himself, a nervous habit from years of solo research. Okay. Not dead. Pods destroyed. Communication array is probably scattered across 3 square kilometers. Rescue beacon is... He patted his belt, finding the emergency transmitter crushed into useless fragments. Perfect. Just perfect. At least it can't get worse. The universe, Jaren had learned, took that sort of statement as a personal challenge. He spent the next hour salvaging what he could from the wreckage, a functioning water purifier, some protein bars that had somehow survived, a data pad with a cracked screen, and his universal translator, which seemed undamaged. The medical kit was missing its trauma supplies but still had basic antibiotics and a dermal regenerator that sputtered hopefully when activated. His weapons locker had been crushed, which meant his only defense was a multi-tool and his sparkling personality. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion crept in. Jaren's hands shook as he tried to organize his supplies, and his mind kept returning to the growing problem of his situation. He was alone on an uncharted moon, light years from the nearest human outpost, with no way to call for help. The Frontier Survey Corps would eventually notice he'd missed his check-in, but eventually could mean weeks or months. He had enough supplies for maybe 10 days if he was very careful and very lucky. The sound came as he was attempting to set up a basic perimeter sensor, a soft rustle in the bioluminescent undergrowth that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. Jaren froze, his xenobiology training suddenly very loud in his head. Azira was classified as potentially inhabited but unconfirmed. Indigenous life had been detected from orbital surveys, but no contact protocols had been established because no one had been stupid enough to crash here before. He turned slowly, scanning the alien jungle. The vegetation swayed gently, its internal light pulsing in patterns that might have been communication or might have been simple biology. Nothing moved in the shadows between the strange trees. But the feeling persisted, the crawling certainty that he wasn't alone, that something intelligent was watching him from the crimson darkness. Jaren's breath came faster, fogging the inside of his helmet's visor. He reached for the multi-tool, knowing it was useless, needing something solid in his hands anyway. The jungle remained still, but the silence felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. He was being hunted. His scientific mind recognized the signs even as his primal brain screamed at him to run. But run where? He was stranded on an alien moon with nowhere to hide and no way home. Hello. His voice cracked slightly. I'm friendly. Non-hostile. I come in peace. The words sounded absurd even as he spoke them, every first contact cliché his training had warned him against. The jungle offered no response except the gentle pulse of bioluminescent life and the weight of unseen eyes judging whether he was predator, prey, or something else entirely. 3 days of paranoid survival had turned Jaren into a twitchy mess who jumped at his own shadow and held entire conversations with his malfunctioning datapad. He'd managed to set up a pathetic excuse for a shelter near a phosphorescent waterfall that glowed like liquid starlight, using salvaged pod panels and some exceptionally optimistic knots. The structure looked like it would collapse if a particularly aggressive butterfly landed on it, but it kept most of the crimson rain off his head, which felt like a minor victory. The feeling of being watched had never left. If anything, it had intensified, becoming as constant as his own heartbeat. Jaren caught glimpses sometimes. A flash of movement in his peripheral vision, the sense of displacement in the bioluminescent patterns, footprints in the moss that definitely weren't his own. Whatever was out there seemed content to observe rather than attack, which was either very good or very, very bad. His xenobiology training suggested predators who studied their prey were usually the intelligent kind, and intelligent predators were infinitely more dangerous than the merely hungry ones. You know what the worst part is? Jaren muttered to the water purifier as it gurgled away. The worst part is I'm actually getting used to you watching me. We're like roommates now. Weird, potentially murderous roommates, but still. He spooned reconstituted protein paste into his mouth and grimaced. If you're going to kill me, could you at least wait until after I've had something that doesn't taste like cardboard mixed with disappointment? The jungle remained silent, but Jaren could have sworn something in the darkness was amused. Twilight on Azira was a particularly unsettling time. The twin moons rose in sequence, their combined light turning everything into a landscape of sharp shadows and impossible colors. Jaren had learned to hate twilight because that's when the sound started. Clicks and whistles and melodic phrases that were definitely not wind through the crystalline trees. Language. Communication. Whatever was out there wasn't just intelligent, it was talking, possibly about him, possibly coordinating. He was testing the seal on his shelter's entrance panel when she appeared. One moment the clearing was empty except for the gentle cascade of glowing water and the pulse of alien vegetation. The next, she was simply there, as if she'd materialized from the shadows themselves. Jaren's heart tried to exit through his throat, and he made a noise that was embarrassingly close to a squeak. She stood at the edge of his makeshift camp, utterly still in a way that humans couldn't manage. The bioluminescence painted her in shifting shades of green and gold, emerald skin that seemed to drink in the light and reflected back transformed, lean muscle moving beneath the surface like water over stone. She wore minimal clothing, some kind of woven material that looked organic, decorated with patterns that might have been ceremonial or might have been purely functional. Her ears rose from her skull in elegant points, twitching independently as they tracked every sound in the environment. But it was her eyes that froze him in place, amber and luminous, with vertical pupils that dilated as she studied him with the focus of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Or a predator deciding where to bite first. "Hi," Jaren said, because his brain had apparently decided this was a completely reasonable situation for casual greetings. "Hello. Salutations. I come in peace." His hand drifted toward the universal translator clipped to his belt. "I'm just going to reach for my translator, okay? Slowly. See? Very slowly. Very non-threatening." She tilted her head, those remarkable ears swiveling toward him, and took a step closer. Then another. Her movements were liquid and utterly silent, placing her feet with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of every centimeter of this terrain. Jaren noticed she had markings along her arms, patterns that caught the bioluminescent light, and that her fingers ended in nails that were definitely sharp enough to be classified as natural weapons. Right, so, I'm Jaren. Human. From Earth. Definitely not supposed to be here. Navigation malfunction. Very embarrassing, really. He was babbling, his mouth running on autopilot while his brain tried desperately to remember first contact protocols. You're probably wondering what a human is doing crashing into your moon. Fair question. Great question. The answer involves bureaucratic oversight and a recurring nightmare I have about my flight instructor. She circled him slowly, and Jaren forced himself to remain still even as every instinct screamed at him to run. She was close enough now that he could smell her, something earthy and foreign with an undertone of the copper scent that permeated Azira's atmosphere. She paused behind him, and he felt rather than heard her lean in, sniffing at his environment suit with obvious curiosity. The suit's synthetic polymer, Jaren offered weakly. Recycled materials, mostly. Not very tasty, I'd imagine. I mean, not that you were planning to taste it. Or me. Hopefully not me. She completed her circle and stood directly in front of him, uncomfortably close, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to check if he had something stuck in his teeth. When she finally spoke, her voice was melodic and utterly alien, full of clicks and tonal variations that his ears couldn't properly process. The translator on his belt chirped uncertainly, displaying fragmented translations that made no sense. Sky. Broken thing. Soft meat. Curious smell. Okay, so the translator needs work, Jaren said. But yes, I'm the broken thing that fell from the sky. Very soft. Extremely fragile. Definitely not worth eating. He attempted what he hoped was a friendly smile, though he suspected it looked more like a grimace of terror. You're very impressive. Evolutionarily speaking. The stealth capabilities alone suggest apex predator status, and the obvious intelligence indicates sophisticated social structures. She reached out suddenly, and Jaren flinched despite himself. Her fingers, surprisingly warm, touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with careful precision. She pressed gently against his skin, testing its texture, then tapped his helmet with one sharp nail, producing a hollow sound. Her expression was impossible to read, but something in her amber eyes suggested fascination rather than aggression. Friend. Jaren tried hopefully. Peaceful coexistence? Mutual non-consumption pact. A sound emerged from deep in her chest, something between a purr and a growl that made Jaren's hair stand on end. Then she smiled, revealing teeth that were definitely designed for tearing meat, including 2 elongated canines that absolutely justified every vampire legend humanity had ever conceived. But there was something in that smile beyond threat, curiosity maybe, or amusement at his obvious fear. A distant roar echoed across the wilderness, deep and resonant enough to vibrate in Jaren's chest. Her entire demeanor shifted instantly. The curiosity vanished, replaced by pure predatory alertness. She turned toward the sound, her body tensing, and then looked back at him one final time. She spoke again, and this time the translator caught a single clear word, hide. Then she was gone, disappearing into the bioluminescent jungle as if she'd never existed, leaving Jaren alone with his racing heart and the growing certainty that whatever had made that roar was something even she considered dangerous. Jaren spent the next 2 days in a state of heightened paranoia that made his previous anxiety look like casual concern. The roar hadn't repeated itself, but its echo seemed permanently lodged in his nervous system, triggering random panic spikes whenever the wind moved through the crystalline trees. He'd reinforced his shelter with additional panels, which mostly meant it now looked like a drunk engineer's art project, and he'd started keeping a makeshift spear within arm's reach at all times. The spear was just a sharpened piece of hull plating attached to a branch with medical tape, but it made him feel slightly less like prey. She returned on the 4th night, emerging from the shadows while he was attempting to coax his failing solar charger back to life by whispering threats and promises to it. Come on, you piece of Martian garbage. If you die on me, I swear I'll tell everyone at the core that you were designed by the lowest bidder. He shook it gently, as if that would somehow fix the internal circuitry. I'll write a scathing review. 1 star. Would not recommend for catastrophic survival situations. A soft sound, almost like a laugh, made him spin around so fast he nearly fell over his own feet. She stood at the edge of his camp again, those amber eyes gleaming with what he was increasingly certain was amusement. In her hands, she carried something that looked disturbingly like a dead animal, except it had too many legs and bioluminescent patches that still pulsed weakly. "Oh," Jaren said intelligently. "You brought dinner. How thoughtful." He eyed the creature with deep suspicion. "Is that safe for human consumption?" "Because my digestive system is notoriously terrible with new proteins. I once got violently ill from Centauri moss bread, and that was technically designed for human consumption." She moved closer, holding out the creature with an expression that seemed expectant. When he didn't immediately take it, she made an impatient clicking sound and thrust it toward him more insistently. "Right, okay, gift-giving behavior. This is good. This is positive cultural exchange." Jaren accepted the dead thing gingerly, trying not to think about its texture. "Thank you. Very kind. Extremely generous. I'll just put this over here for later analysis." He set the creature down on a flat rock, and she watched him with obvious confusion. She pointed at the animal, then at her mouth, making exaggerated chewing motions. Then she pointed at him expectantly. "You want me to eat it now? Raw?" Jaren's stomach did an uncomfortable flip. See, humans have this thing about cooking food. Fire. Thermal processing. Kills the parasites, breaks down the proteins. Very important for our inferior digestive systems. He mimed cooking, complete with sound effects, which made her ears twitch in that way he was learning meant interest. She settled down cross-legged near his fire pit, apparently deciding this was happening, and watched him with unwavering attention as he attempted to prepare alien roadkill for consumption. Jaren found some flat stones to use as a cooking surface and awkwardly began butchering the creature with his multi-tool, very aware of her scrutiny. "So, I'm going to guess you're some kind of outcast or scout," he said, because talking helped settle his nerves. "You're alone out here, you're curious about the stupid human, and you haven't tried to eat me yet, which suggests either remarkable restraint or I look unappetizing." "I'm hoping for the latter." He managed to separate what might have been meat from what was definitely not meat. "Where I come from, I'm also kind of an outcast. Too curious, not good with authority, tendency to make inappropriate jokes during serious situations. Got me sent on solo survey missions where I can't annoy anyone." She tilted her head, and he could see her trying to puzzle out his words. The translator on his belt chirped occasionally, catching fragments, alone, curious, food, but missing most of the nuance. The meat sizzled on the hot stone, and to Jaren's genuine surprise, it didn't smell terrible. Actually, it smelled almost pleasant, like roasted nuts with a hint of something spicy. When he finally tried a small piece, his taste buds reported back with cautious approval. "Okay, that's actually not bad," he admitted. "Gamey, but good. You're an excellent hunter." He offered her a piece, and she accepted it with what might have been a smile, though her version of smiling still involved showing far too many sharp teeth for his comfort. They ate in companionable silence, and Jaren noticed she seemed to relax slightly, her predatory alertness softening into something almost peaceful. When the food was gone, she reached into a small pouch at her side and withdrew something that glowed softly, a bioluminescent paste in what looked like an organic container. She held it up to the light, examining it, then suddenly grabbed his hand. "Whoa, hey, what are you?" His protest died as she began applying the paste to a cut on his palm he'd gotten from the jagged metal earlier. The substance tingled on contact, and he watched in fascination as the wound began to close, the pain fading to nothing. "That's incredible. What is that?" "Some kind of accelerated healing compound derived from local flora." His scientist brain immediately started cataloging possibilities. The bioluminescent properties suggest energy transfer at the cellular level. "Can I?" She released his hand and stood abruptly, moving to the edge of his shelter. She picked up his datapad from where he'd left it charging, turning it over in her hands with careful curiosity. When the screen flickered to life at her touch, her ears shot forward in surprise. "It's a computer," Jaren explained, moving to stand beside her. "Information storage." I use it for research notes, stellar cartography, terrible fiction when I'm bored. He swiped through some images. Earth, various planets, his research subjects. She watched intently, occasionally reaching out to touch the screen, delighted when the images changed under her fingers. He pulled up a star map, and her reaction was immediate. She leaned in close, one finger tracing the patterns of stars, then looked up at the sky through a gap in his shelter. She pointed at specific stars, then back at the map, making a connection that suggested she understood exactly what she was looking at. She tapped insistently on one system, speaking rapidly in her language. The translator struggled and spat out, "Home, many, scattered, sky paths, broken. Your people are scattered across multiple star systems?" Jaren felt his excitement rising despite the communication barrier. "You're not just indigenous to Azira. You're spacefaring, or you were. What happened?" She made a gesture that the translator interpreted as war, or possibly catastrophe, and her expression darkened. Then she shook her head as if dismissing painful memories and returned her attention to the datapad. She found his music files and accidentally activated one, jumping back at the sudden sound of classical music filling the shelter. Jaren couldn't help but laugh at her startled expression, those impressive ears pinned back against her skull. "It's just music. Sound for enjoyment. Here, look." He showed her how to control the volume, and her wonder returned. She experimented with different tracks, her body swaying slightly to certain rhythms, and Jaren found himself smiling despite everything. They spent the next hour in unexpected companionship, trading objects and observations. She showed him how to read the bioluminescent patterns in the local fungi, warnings of weather changes, apparently. He showed her how his water purifier worked, which fascinated her enough that she insisted on operating it herself several times. It was clumsy and imperfect, two beings from different worlds trying to bridge an impossible gap with gestures and broken translations and mutual curiosity. When she finally prepared to leave, she paused at the shelter entrance and spoke a phrase the translator actually caught clearly. "Tomorrow. Return. Teach more." Jaren watched her disappear into the glowing jungle and realized with surprise that he was looking forward to tomorrow. He was still stranded, still possibly doomed, but for the first time since crashing on this alien moon, he didn't feel quite so alone. The razor spine came at dawn, which Jaren would later argue was deeply unfair because dawn was when he was least prepared to deal with six-legged crystalline nightmares. He'd been attempting to shave using a piece of reflective metal and some questionable hygiene practices when the ground started shaking. His first thought was earthquake. His second thought, upon hearing the bellowing roar that made his previous terror seem quaint, was that earthquakes would have been preferable. The creature exploded through the tree line like a living battering ram, and Jaren's scientific brain had exactly enough time to register hexapital, approximately 4 meters tall, crystalline protrusions along dorsal ridge, definitely carnivorous, before his survival brain took over and screamed a single word: run. He ran, abandoning his pathetic shelter and most of his supplies in a graceless sprint that would have embarrassed his academy physical fitness instructors. Behind him, the razor spine demolished his camp with what sounded like enthusiastic malice, roaring its displeasure at finding only synthetic materials and protein bars instead of soft human flesh. "Not food," Jaren panted as he crashed through bioluminescent undergrowth. "Terrible nutritional value. Mostly anxiety and poor life choices." A branch whipped across his face, and he tasted copper. Also very stringy. Bad texture. 1 star, would not recommend. The razor spine disagreed with his assessment and pursued with single-minded determination, its crystalline spine scraping against trees and leaving glowing scars in the bark. Jaren's lungs burned in Azira's thin atmosphere, and his legs screamed protests, but the alternative to running was becoming an exotic breakfast item, so he pushed harder. He had no idea where he was going, just away, anywhere that wasn't within eating distance of several tons of aggressive mineral-plated predator. The terrain grew rougher, obsidian outcroppings rising like black fangs, and Jaren's footing became increasingly uncertain. He slipped on luminescent moss, caught himself on a jagged rock that tore through his suit sleeve, and kept moving because stopping meant dying and he'd come too far to die over bad navigation and worse luck. She appeared like a miracle of terrible timing, dropping from an overhead outcropping directly into his path. Jaren nearly collided with her, managed an awkward dodge that sent him sprawling, and looked up to find her assessing the situation with rapid eye movements between him and the approaching razor spine. Her expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for him to read, settling on something that looked like exasperated determination. She grabbed his arm, her grip was shockingly strong, and hauled him upright, already moving. She pulled him toward a cliff face that looked completely solid, and Jaren's brain registered, about to hit rock wall at high speed, before she twisted sideways, and suddenly they were in a narrow crevice he hadn't seen, barely wide enough for his shoulders. The passage wound through the cliff in ways that seemed geologically impossible, twisting and dropping in disorienting patterns. She moved with absolute confidence in the darkness, one hand on his wrist, dragging him deeper into the rock. Behind them, the razor spine roared frustration, too large to follow, its crystalline spine scraping against stone in sounds that set Jaren's teeth on edge. They descended for what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the passage gradually widening until they emerged into a cavern that took Jaren's breath away. Bioluminescent fungi covered the walls in intricate patterns that provided gentle light, and the space was clearly inhabited. Crude furniture carved from stone, woven materials hanging from natural hooks in the rock, tools and containers arranged with obvious care. This wasn't just shelter. This was home. She released his wrist and moved to a natural alcove, returning with a container of water that she thrust at him without ceremony. Jaren drank gratefully, his hands shaking from adrenaline crash, and tried to process what had just happened. "You saved my life," he said when he could speak without gasping. "That thing would have turned me into human carpaccio, and you just... Thank you. Seriously. Thank you." She made a dismissive gesture, but something in her expression suggested pleased embarrassment. She examined his torn suit sleeve with critical attention, clicking her tongue, an apparently universal sound of disapproval, at the gash on his arm beneath. Before he could protest, she retrieved the bioluminescent healing paste and began treating the wound with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," Jaren observed, watching her work. "Medical training, or whatever your culture's equivalent is. You're not just a hunter. You're a healer too." The translator caught fragments of his words, and she glanced up, meeting his eyes briefly before returning to her task. When she finished, she gestured around the cavern, speaking in that melodic, clicking language. The translator worked overtime: safe, home, stay, danger outside, broken skyfaller, too soft. "Yeah, I got that last part from the nearly being eaten," Jaren said. "I'm extremely soft and poorly designed for survival on alien moons. My species specialized in anxiety and complicated coffee drinks, not outrunning crystal-covered murder beasts." She made that sound again, the one that might have been laughter, and settled onto a stone bench, gesturing for him to sit. He did, grateful to rest his shaking legs, and took the opportunity to really examine her home. The symbols carved into the walls were similar to the markings on her arms, some kind of writing system or artistic expression. Tools hung within easy reach, their purposes mysterious but suggesting sophisticated craftsmanship. A sleeping area in one corner contained woven materials that looked surprisingly comfortable. "You're alone here," Jaren said softly. "An outcast, like I guessed. But this place is too well established for recent exile. You've been here a while." He looked at her, seeing past the predatory grace to something else. Loneliness maybe, or determination, or both. "What happened? Why are you out here by yourself?" She was quiet for a long moment, those amber eyes distant. Then she began to speak, slowly, giving the translator time to work. The story that emerged was fragmented and imperfect, but the shape of it became clear. Her people, scattered across the star systems surrounding Thelmus, had fractured into tribal groups after some catastrophe. She had violated some cultural boundary, made some choice that resulted in banishment. The translator couldn't capture the specifics, but her tone conveyed old pain and stubborn pride. "Forbidden knowledge?" Jaren guessed. "You wanted to learn things your people said were taboo?" "Yeah, I know that feeling. Got myself kicked out of 3 research programs for asking the wrong questions." He smiled without humor. "We're a pair, aren't we? 2 outcasts on a crimson moon, trying to figure out how not to die alone." She tilted her head, and the translator caught a single word. "Together." "Yeah," Jaren said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Together sounds better than alone. She rose and moved to another alcove, returning with what looked like dried meat and some kind of bread made from processed fungi. She offered it with a gesture that was becoming familiar. Practical hospitality from someone who didn't waste effort on ceremony. They ate in comfortable silence, and Jaren felt something shift between them, some barrier crossing from wary cooperation into tentative friendship. Outside, the razor spine eventually gave up and departed, its frustrated roars fading into the distance. Inside the cave, two beings from different worlds shared a meal and began to understand that sometimes survival required more than just staying alive. Sometimes it required connection, even across the impossible distance between species, even when communication was broken and imperfect. Jaren looked at the symbols on the walls, at this woman who had saved his life twice now, and thought that maybe crashing on Azira wasn't entirely catastrophic after all. Living in the cave system with her transformed Jaren's understanding of survival and made him acutely aware of how useless his academy training had been for actual wilderness existence. She moved through each day with fluid purpose while he stumbled through basic tasks like an enthusiastic but incompetent apprentice. She found this endlessly entertaining, if her frequent ear-twitching and that almost laugh sound were any indication. "Okay, so apparently I've been eating the wrong fungi for 3 days," Jaren said, examining the specimens she'd laid out on a flat stone. "These blue ones are nutritious. These purple ones cause hallucinations and digestive distress. They look nearly identical, which feels like a design flaw in the universe." He poked at the purple ones accusingly. "Though that would explain why I had that dream about my datapad singing opera." She demonstrated the difference, a subtle variation in the gill structure that Jaren had completely missed, and he committed it to memory with the desperate focus of someone who'd prefer not to accidentally poison himself. The translator had been gradually improving as it accumulated more data on her language, now catching perhaps 30% of what she said, though context remained frustratingly elusive. The fungi lesson was followed by water reading, which involved studying the bioluminescent patterns in streams to determine safety. Then came weather prediction based on atmospheric humidity and the behavior of small flying creatures that looked like crystalline butterflies. Then movement techniques, how to place his feet to avoid noise, how to use the natural terrain for concealment, how to breathe in Azira's thin air without gasping like a drowning fish. "I'm basically a toddler in your world," Jaren observed after tripping over his own feet for the 5th time while attempting her gliding walk. "An oversized, clumsy toddler who asks too many questions and can't tell the difference between food and poison." She responded with something the translator interpreted as accurate assessment, and continued the lesson with patient determination. Evenings became Jaren's favorite time. They'd return to the cave as the twin moons rose, and he'd share stories of Earth and the colonies while she listened with focused attention. He showed her images on his datapad, oceans and cities, starships and space stations, the vast diversity of human civilization spread across dozens of worlds. Her fascination was obvious, and she'd point at things, asking questions the translator struggled to convey. "That's called coffee," Jaren explained, showing her an image of a steaming cup. "Liquid motivation. Humanity's most important discovery after fire and the wheel. I would commit minor crimes for real coffee right now. The synthetic stuff in my supplies tastes like despair mixed with burnt plastic." She disappeared into a storage alcove and returned with something that looked like dried berries, offering them with an expectant expression. Jaren tried one cautiously and nearly spat it out, intensely bitter with an astringent aftertaste that made his tongue feel fuzzy. But underneath the unpleasantness was a distinct stimulant effect, a clarity spreading through his exhausted brain. "This is basically alien coffee," he said with genuine delight. "Terrible, awful alien coffee, but I love it anyway." He chewed another berry, grimacing through the taste. "You're a genius. A beautiful, terrifying genius." Something in her expression changed at that, a subtle shift he couldn't quite interpret, before she turned her attention back to the datapad. She'd become particularly interested in his music collection, and she'd developed favorites, though her taste ran toward complex instrumental pieces rather than anything with vocals. She'd sway slightly to certain rhythms, and Jaren found himself watching her move with appreciation that had nothing to do with xenobiology. Which was dangerous territory his brain kept trying to wander into despite his better judgment. "Tell me about your people," he said one night, changing the subject away from thoughts he shouldn't be having. "The translator's getting better. I want to understand." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the bioluminescent moss that grew near the cave entrance. Then she began to speak, slowly and deliberately, giving the translator time to work. Her people called themselves something the translator rendered as Starwalkers, or possibly Sky-Blooded. The nuance was unclear. They'd once been a unified civilization spanning multiple worlds in the Thelma system, before a catastrophic civil war over resource distribution and philosophical differences had shattered them into isolated tribal groups. Technology had been lost or deliberately destroyed, leaving the survivors scattered across moons and planets with only fragments of their former knowledge. She'd been part of a scholarly caste, dedicated to preserving old knowledge, but she'd advocated for reconnection with other tribes and recovery of lost technology. The tribal elders had deemed this heresy, a violation of the isolation doctrine that had emerged after the war. Rather than submit, she'd chosen exile, taking what knowledge she could carry into the wilderness. "So you're not just an outcast," Jaren said softly. "You're a revolutionary. A keeper of forbidden knowledge." He smiled. "Yeah, we're definitely kindred spirits." She met his eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, a connection that transcended species and language. The moment stretched, charged with unspoken meaning, before she looked away and began preparing their evening meal. Days blended into a comfortable routine. She taught him survival. He taught her about human technology and culture. They communicated through broken translations and gestures and the growing ability to read each other's body language. Jaren found himself noticing details he probably shouldn't. The way her ears expressed emotion, the grace in her movements, the intelligence in those amber eyes that saw through his jokes to the loneliness underneath. 2 weeks after the razor spine attack, she took him to a place she'd clearly never shown anyone. They climbed for hours through increasingly treacherous terrain, until they emerged onto a cliff-top overlook that stole what little breath Jaren had left. The view stretched for kilometers, Azira's crimson wilderness spreading below, the twin moons hanging huge in the purple sky, and in the distance, the gas giant Thelmus rising like a painted god, its storm systems visible even from this distance. "This is sacred to your people," Jaren said quietly. The translator confirmed it, a place of meditation, of connection to the ancestors, of profound spiritual significance. She nodded, then spoke a phrase the translator caught clearly: "Share with you. Trust." Jaren felt the weight of that trust, the significance of being brought to this place. He wanted to say something profound, something worthy of the moment, but what came out was, "I'm really glad I crashed on your moon instead of one of the lifeless ones. Would have been a much shorter and less interesting story." She made that almost laugh sound, and they sat together on the cliff's edge, two outcasts from different worlds, watching the moons trace their eternal paths across an alien sky. Jaren thought about rescue missions that might never come, about the growing certainty that he didn't want to leave even if they did, about the dangerous warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with stimulant berries. He was falling for an alien woman on a crimson moon, and somehow that seemed like the most natural thing in the universe. The hunting party found them 3 weeks after Jaren had stopped counting days. He'd been attempting to weave plant fibers into something resembling cordage, badly, judging by her amused supervision, when she suddenly went rigid, her ears swiveling toward the cave entrance. Every line of her body shifted into predatory alertness, and Jaren's stomach dropped because he'd learned to read that particular tension. "Company?" he asked, already reaching for his pathetic spear. She nodded once, sharp and certain, then moved to the entrance with liquid speed. Jaren followed, his heart hammering, and peered out to see 5 figures emerging from the bioluminescent jungle. They moved like her, silent, graceful, deadly, but where she radiated cautious intelligence, they projected pure hostility. All 5 carried weapons that looked disturbingly functional, carved from some dark material that seemed to absorb light, and their body language screamed aggression. Her people. Her tribe. And they were absolutely not happy to see a human. She stepped out of the cave before Jaren could stop her, positioning herself between him and the approaching warriors. The lead figure, larger than the others, with elaborate markings that suggested rank, began speaking in rapid, harsh tones. Even without the translator, Jaren could hear the anger, the accusation. She responded with equal intensity, her voice rising in what was clearly argument rather than explanation. The translator worked frantically, spitting out fragments: contamination, outsider, forbidden, tradition violated, must be cleansed. Okay, so they want me dead, Jaren muttered. Great. Fantastic. This is going well. The argument escalated, voices sharp and clicking, bodies tense. Two of the warriors moved to flank her, trying to get angles on Jaren, and she shifted to block them, her movements predatory and warning. The lead warrior said something that made her entire body stiffen with rage, and she snarled back, an actual snarl that raised every hair on Jaren's neck. They were going to fight. She was going to fight her own people to protect him, and it was going to get her killed or exiled even deeper, and Jaren couldn't let that happen. His brain scrambled for solutions, for anything that might defuse the situation, for words that would bridge the impossible gap between species and convince these warriors that he wasn't a threat. What came out of his mouth instead, in a moment of pure stress-induced catastrophe, was, "Your ass is so nice." The entire clearing went silent. Every warrior froze mid-motion. The lead figure's ears pinned back in confusion. And she turned slowly, her amber eyes going impossibly wide, her expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been mortification. I mean, Jaren's brain finally caught up with his mouth, and he wanted to die. I didn't mean, that's not what the translator. But she was laughing. Not the almost laugh he'd grown accustomed to, but full, deep, genuine laughter that echoed across the obsidian cliffs and made the warriors exchange bewildered glances. She doubled over slightly, one hand pressed to her midsection, those remarkable ears twitching wildly, and when she looked at him again her eyes were bright with mirth that temporarily overrode the tension. She said something to the warriors, still laughing, and the translator caught enough to make Jaren want to sink into the ground. Skyfaller, broken words, speak stupidity, harmless, like confused child. The lead warrior responded with what sounded like skepticism, but the edge of violence had dulled slightly, replaced by confusion and what might have been grudging amusement. She seized the shift in mood, speaking rapidly and gesturing between Jaren and herself, occasionally pointing at the cave. The translator struggled with the nuance, but Jaren caught the shape of her argument. Something about knowledge exchange, about the value of understanding outsiders, about the old ways of her people before the isolation doctrine. One of the flanking warriors spoke, and the translator rendered it as a question about Jaren's purpose. She responded by pulling out his datapad, showing them the star maps, the images of other worlds, explaining, as far as Jaren could tell, about human civilization and the potential for peaceful contact. The warriors crowded around, their hostility warring with obvious curiosity. The negotiation lasted for what felt like hours, conducted in rapid language that left Jaren dizzy trying to follow. He stood there, acutely aware of his continued survival hanging on her diplomatic skills and the absurd comment that had somehow broken the killing tension. Finally, the lead warrior spoke what sounded like a pronouncement, and she visibly relaxed. The warriors departed as silently as they'd arrived, leaving her and Jaren alone in the clearing. She turned to him, and her expression was complicated, relief, exhaustion, lingering amusement, and something warmer he didn't dare name. "So," Jaren said weakly, "that happened. Did I just accidentally start first contact with your species by complimenting your—" "Yeah. I'm going to stop talking now." She moved closer, and he noticed her hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline crash. She spoke softly, and the translator caught most of it, agreed, "Temporary. You stay, learn our ways. I teach, they watch, prove harmless, prove worthy." "I can do harmless," Jaren said. "Harmless is basically my default setting. Occasionally punctuated by catastrophically inappropriate comments during life-threatening situations." She reached out and placed her hand against his chest, right over his racing heart, and said something the translator rendered simply as, "Safe. Together." "Together," Jaren echoed, covering her hand with his own. "Yeah. I can work with together." She smiled then, not the predatory display of teeth but something genuine and warm that transformed her entire face, and Jaren realized with absolute certainty that he'd been changed by this place, by her, by the impossible connection they'd built across the vast distance between their worlds. He'd crashed on Azira as a lonely xenobiologist running from his own inadequacies. He'd survived as something more, someone who'd learned that survival meant trust, that communication transcended language, that connection could bloom even in the strangest soil. "We should probably work on my vocabulary," Jaren said. Establish some boundaries around what not to say during tense diplomatic situations. She laughed again, that beautiful sound he'd come to treasure, and pulled him back toward the cave. The twin moons rose overhead, painting everything in shades of silver and crimson, and somewhere in the distance a razor spine roared its territorial claim. But in the cave entrance, two outcasts stood together, and Jaren thought that maybe being stranded on an alien moon with a wild vampire woman who found him both idiotic and endearing wasn't the worst fate the universe could have dealt him. Actually, it might have been exactly what he needed all along. The end.